Okay. So yeah, thank you for the introduction. And this talk that I'll be speaking about now, it is part of a larger project, managing flies for pollination, that was funded by Berries Australia and Hort Innovations. Riley spoke about it earlier, so we're going back to flies now. And since I'm an entomologist and pollination biologist, I'm going to start off with talking a little bit about blueberry floral biology. So blueberry flowers have poricidal anthers, and if you're not sure what that means, they're like the pores on your skin. They're little tiny holes, and these holes are at the tips of the anthers, and that is where the pollen comes out of the blueberry flowers. And this is very different from other berry flowers like strawberry and raspberry that have these open flowers with a lot of anthers, and the anthers split open and just readily release pollen. And so it's thought that the shape of blueberry flowers and their poricidal anthers are why pollinators are needed to pollinate blueberry. But as it turns out, this is entirely dependent on the type of berry cultivars that you're growing. So Dr. Karen Santos is a postdoctoral research fellow like myself at UNE, and she was really interested in determining just how dependent these different berry cultivars are on pollinators to set fruit. And so she essentially ranked 7 blueberry, 3 raspberry, and 2 blackberry cultivars that are commonly grown in the mid-north coast, so Coffs Harbour region of New South Wales, and she ranked them on how dependent they are. So we'll start off with low pollinator dependency. As you can see, there are 2 blueberry cultivars here. And to put things simply, from Karen's self-pollination treatments, so the plant was pollinating itself, she found that most of the fruits she harvested were actually marketable, meaning very few pollinators were needed to actually set fruits for these 2 blueberry cultivars. Next, we have medium pollinator dependency. This is when you're going to start hearing things like pollinators will enhance your yields, and that is because that's exactly what they're doing. From Karen's trials, she found that of the self-pollinated fruits that she harvested, give or take, 50% were marketable and 50% were not marketable. So at this point, you are definitely going to want to see pollinators visiting flowers in your field. Finally, high pollinator dependency, exactly what it sounds like. These varieties really depended on pollinators to set fruit. Of the self-pollinated fruits, none of them were marketable, so you are really going to need to see pollinators visiting your flowers in the field. So as you can see, the blueberry cultivars that are commonly grown now, they actually range in terms of their pollinator dependency. But what actually pollinates blueberry? So obviously we have the honeybee. A lot of people have talked about this today. It's a great managed pollinator and it's used all throughout Australia. But there are other pollinators as well of blueberry, including bumblebees, stingless bees, carpenter bees, solitary bees, and then things are going to get a little bit strange. We have honey eaters, which are birds, and blowflies. So if we think about this in more of like a commercial pollination perspective, honeybees are super popular because they're managed. There are 2 bee groups here that are also managed, the bumblebees and the stingless bees. But like Fiona was mentioning earlier, the bumblebees, they're used because they're great buzz pollinators in other parts of the world, but they're invasive here in Australia, so we shouldn't really be focusing on these kinds of bees here. We also have stingless bees, which are managed. Their colonies are much smaller than honeybees. They're kind of expensive as well, but they are great blueberry pollinators if you live in an area with these stingless bees around. The carpenter bees and the solitary bees, they are also wonderful berry pollinators, but I feel like you never see them in large enough numbers in your field to actually affect yields. So you need to have the kind of habitat that they require in order to actually see them making a difference in your fields. And the honey eaters, this one I just threw in as kind of a fun fact. It was actually Karen who determined that these birds are effectively pollinating blueberry and also eating caterpillars off of blueberry plants, meaning they're giving you a 2-for-1 service. But I realized that birds and berries are a terrible marketing ploy, so that's definitely not an option, which leaves us with the flies. And I'll go through this quickly because Riley mentioned it. But why flies? Um, the ones we're looking at, they are ecosystem service providers. We're not going to put mosquitoes in your polytunnels. That is an awful idea. And truthfully, they are disservice providers because that's their purpose. But the flies we look at, they provide pollination services as adults, and they usually are providing you another service in their larval stage. And this isn't without a lot of research. Flies are actually the second most important pollinator group behind bees. This is well known for years now, and that's because flies possess morphological traits that make them good pollinators. So you can see in some of these photos, they're really hairy and they kind of trap pollen and they move it around really well on flowers. And as Rayleigh spoke about, flies are quite easy to rear in large numbers and on cost-effective substrates, and you need large numbers of pollinators to pollinate your large-scale fields. And finally, just as an added bonus, these flies that we're studying, they don't sting and bite, meaning you can use them in enclosed spaces, research trials, and also with your farm workers around, you don't have to worry about anything harmful happening. So, with all of this in mind, this is why we have been studying flies as potential commercial pollinators in Australia. We have two outcomes for this grant that we're working on, and the first one is to give growers more options to access reliable, commercially available pollinators. And I mentioned blowflies earlier. So Dr. David Cook from the DPIRD in WA, he was the one that determined blowflies are effective commercial blueberry pollinators. He's also a part of this grant that we're on. And while he determined blowflies are effective, we have been studying flower flies or syrphid flies as blueberry pollinators. And we're looking at these two species here. The first is Aristolus tenax, and if there's anything you take away from my talk today, it would be the name of this fly. And that is because it is already well known to be a generalist effective pollinator. It's sold for commercial pollination services in Europe by a Spanish company at the moment. They've already done some trials with these flies in enclosed spaces. We know they're good pollinators. But here in Australia, they're currently being bred for research purposes by Seed Purity, based here in Tasmania. And then we also have another fly, Aristolinius punctulatus. This one is my favorite, and that is because as part of my PhD, I determined that this fly was an effective hybrid seed carrot pollinator in the Riverina region of New South Wales. Because it has similar breeding protocols to Aristolus tenax, we decided to also try and use this fly in another commercial crop. So this was our trial. We conducted this last year, and the goal of the project was very simple, just to see if flies can actually pollinate blueberry. And so we conducted this at Costa Farm in Corindi, and we set up these 8 cages in the field. This was 4 cages per fly species, and we compared fly pollinated fruit weight with open pollinated fruit weight, which was just nearby the cages in the field. This was mainly by the honeybee. We also looked at pollinator activity, so visitation rates to flowers, and seed set data, so perfect versus imperfect seeds. But I won't be talking about this now because I'm still counting those seeds. So we have here the blueberry yield results. So we harvested about 1,500 fruits in total across 4 weeks, May through June, which is the winter time in Coffs. And it was quite cold and rainy. So if you know anything about snow chaser blueberry, you would know that these numbers are low. And we think this has something to do with the fact that almost all of our plants ended up being infected with blueberry rust. It was really unfortunate. It probably had something to do with our cages. We couldn't quite get the blueberry rust sorted, so just keep in mind that these numbers are quite low. But we did find weekly variation in the fruit weight, which we suspect had something to do with the stocking rate differences of the flies, but we are still working through this. So just for now, I've grouped everything together into this one figure. As you can see, the open pollinated fruits were slightly bigger than all of our other treatments. However, both fly species did successfully enhance the fruit yield of snow chaser, which Karen determined was between medium to high pollinator dependency, which is reflected in these results here. since the fly-pollinated fruits weighed more than our self-pollination treatment. So next, let's look at the flower visitation rate results. I really wish that I had that robot at this time because we were going through and individually counting pollinators on flowers in the field. We conducted about 324 surveys across the 4 weeks in different environmental conditions from about 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. throughout the day. Each one of those data points is an average of about 30 surveys, and each survey was us walking along 4 blueberry plants, and again, just counting the number of pollinators visiting the flower at that time. So, as you can see, Aristolus tenax in yellow was the most abundant visitor of blueberry flowers throughout the day. Honeybees were the least abundant floral visitors throughout the day, and Aristolanius punctulatus was right in the middle. And we actually had set up this experiment just right next to 4 honeybee hives, which is thousands of bees, and we still were only getting between 0 to 2 bees per every 4 plant. So just something to keep in mind. Where do we go from here? Well, with our blueberry trial, again, the seed set data I'll be looking at, as well as looking at how environmental conditions are influencing the pollinator activity within the fields. We're also interested in performing these kinds of trials in different cultivars and in different crops. And we're also interested in looking at interactions with these flies with other pollinators. So I know Riley was saying that they're not aggressive with the honeybee, and we've been seeing that too, but we're also interested in seeing if potentially, if a fly and a bee land on a flower at the same time, could this increase pollination services or decrease pollination services at the flower level? And then we're also interested in doing larger scale trials. And as Rayleigh mentioned, fly field release retention experiments. So if you were to release these flies in the wild, just how many would you actually retain on your farms? But this isn't the only outcome that we're looking at with this grant, Managing Flies for Pollination. We're also interested in creating realistic management practices for growers to implement in the fields to increase their pollinator diversity. And that is because, as we've learned today, honeybees aren't the only effective pollinators of berries. There are a lot of other pollinators out there, and it's important to have these pollinators as like a buffer to your honeybees. And so we are essentially looking to find ways to attract and retain these effective pollinators on your farms. So we have 3 different projects to uh, come up with this outcome now. And we'll start off with the first one with pollinator nesting sites. So this is a project that Dr. Lena Schmidt is working on. She's also a postdoctoral research fellow in the lab. Her goal is to see if you add nesting sites to your fields, if this will increase your pollination and pest control services to berry farms. These nesting sites, they're mainly targeting bees, so we have wooden stalks, which carpenter bees nest in, mud bricks, which leafcutter bees and wasps nest in, and then we also have old rubus canes, which reed bees nest in. And all of these species here have been shown to be pollinators or pest control service providers, mainly the wasps. And as of now, Lena has about 210 of these nests occupied, and 244 different insects have emerged. But this is still a work in progress. She's trying to figure out just how many different pollinators she can get from these small, cost-effective resources she's placing on farms, and hopefully she'll be able to come up with a potential protocol to advise growers. Next, we have the addition of fly habitat pools. This is a project that Yelena Preradovic, who is a PhD candidate at UNE, she's working on this because she wants to know if pollinating flies can complete their life cycles on berry farms if you give them the habitat that they need to survive. So what she did is she picked a farm that there wasn't much pollinator diversity. There were mainly only honeybees visiting flowers, and she added these pools filled with substrates that these flies are supposed to be attracted to. She just wanted to see if they could potentially survive. And what she found is after a week, she started getting eggs from these flies in the substrates. Um, 3 species of syrphid flies developed within the substrate, including 2 species that I hope you guys recognize, Aristolus tenax and Aristolinius punctulatus. And what they did is they developed in the pools, crawled out, and pupated right underneath the pools, which is great. There is another species, Australis caposia, which is the blue fly here. It kind of looks like a blowfly, and this is a really interesting one because we didn't expect this one to be attracted to these pools. There is no pollination data collected on this fly yet, and it's something that we're interested in moving towards, just determining if this fly could potentially pollinate. And also, another thing that Yelena is focusing on is to see if these pools could potentially attract other beneficial insects or potentially pest insects. And so this one is more of a work in progress as to a management practice, but it's part of her thesis and she's been really excited about this. So I wanted to share it with you all now. And finally, we have the planting of floral or forage strips. This is a project that PhD candidate Jessie Moises from QUT is working on. She's also joint supervised by my boss Ramina at UNE. The goal of Jessie's project is to see if the addition of floral strips to farms improves pollinator diversity and ecosystem services to berry farms. And she's collected quite a bit of funding for this project. And for good reason. It's very interesting what she's found so far. She's planted seed mixes within blueberry interrows at Costa Farm in Corindi, and she's collected a lot of data for this trial, but for now I'll just share that she observed about 2,335 visitors of blueberry flowers and also from flowers that emerged from her forage strips. And I identified these species. It ended up being about 48 different groups of insects, different species, in the pollinator community. And these forage strips have actually they've established at Costa, and so as of now, literally this month, she's also going to repeat this trial again to see if she can start seeing some new beneficial insects and other pollinator groups coming to the fields. I can tell you right now that the visitors of blueberry flowers and also her forage strip flowers were mainly honeybees, stingless bees, ants, and syrphid flies. And these syrphid flies are what we are testing. The ones she's finding are providing pest control services as larvae, but they are also visiting flowers. There's not too much information on these kinds of syrphid flies and their potential pollination performance in blueberry, but it's another step that we are thinking about taking with this project. And yeah, this one is a very exciting one. We really hope that this could be a potential management practice that we can suggest that growers use in the future. So I'd like to thank my colleagues and everybody for their help, and of course Hortnovations and Berries Australia for their funding, and thank you all for coming today.
Thank you very much, Abby. Is there something about blueberry flowers that honeybees don't like? Is that known that they don't particularly like foraging on them?
Well, honeybees actually can't buzz pollinate, so they actually kind of struggle to get the pollen out of blueberry flowers. So they're kind of visiting for the nectar, but there's not too much nectar in blueberry flowers compared to other berries. So I think that's why you're not seeing so many honeybees in the field at the time that we were noticing. So
Cool.
yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
Did you know the the distance between the strips of the making the for
The the distance between the forage strips and blueberry?
yes?
Well, they're planted directly in the interrows. So when pickers are going through, they're actually walking right next to these forage strips. It's about, well, it's the distance that Costa has planted their rows. She has about, I think it's about half a meter is the length of the width of the strip.
But every how many meters apart?
Could you say that again? Sorry.
How many parts? How many strips apart?
Oh, so she has 3 rows with strips,
Yeah.
forage strips, and she has two groups of this, so 6 rows in total per plot. And
Okay.
this is like a 1 hectare plot, so it's like 50 rows of blueberry.
Okay. And they when because we use covered crops, but I do put them in like rows as well, or have you tried that?
Um, she planted these in open field
Open.
blueberries,
Okay.
so we're not quite sure if it would work in protected cropping systems, but that would be very interesting
Yeah,
to do.
because they can try it in the leg rows.
Yeah, yeah, it's
Okay.
possible. I
Okay.
mean, it would be like the same distance in the blueberry, but as far as protected cropping goes, we've only been doing protected cropping with rubus, not with
Hmm.
blueberry.
Hmm.
So it's something that we could
Okay.
look at later.
Hello. Did you observe any other beneficial like predator or any parasitoid in the flower strip or any other pest of blueberry?
Pests of blueberry in the floral strip?
Yeah, pest and any other beneficial except pollinator.
Yeah, so that's another thing that Jessie has been looking at. She is still looking through this data now. So, of the 48 species, there's actually way more than that. There's about 60 plus species that used the forage strips and the blueberries. But those other species, they weren't visiting flowers, so we aren't quite sure what their service is yet. But there are some other insects there that are more like providing you predation services or nutrient cycling. But Jessie's still looking through this data, but it is something that she's working on.
Hello. Just had a question about the stingless bee population and the syrphid fly. There's a type of syrphid fly that decimates the native bees with their larvae and completely slimes out the hives. Is the type of syrphid fly you're working with going to affect the native bee population?
Um, in terms of their habitat needs? Oh, yeah. So that is something that we are really looking at. We can't release these flies without actually determining if they are providing a potential disservice to the environment. We're only using them in enclosed spaces at the moment for these kinds of trials. Um, but I will say that Aristolis tenax is a cosmopolitan species in Australia. The other fly we're looking at, Aristolinius punctulatus, is native to Australia and is found in the regions that we are working in. But it is something that that is the next step that we're looking at.
Thank you, Abby, for a great presentation.
Thank you.
I feel like you guys are amazing.